a great deal of its lands. And remember, whenever a state was established, the federal government got all the lands when that state was established. Now, as I'll tell you, it'll give some back to each state, but the lands basically belong to the federal government. The federal government had been intending to dispose of all of these lands except what they needed for military purposes. But in the 1890s, they began to say, oops, I think we want to keep some of these lands. We're concerned because the forests are being devastated in the lake states, and they're already devastated in the east. And so we may have a timber shortage. Also, in many places they were concerned about protecting watersheds. And so the federal government decided that it would begin to establish reserves. And the first way it started doing that was Congress authorized the president to set aside portions of the land that the federal government controlled for permanent reserves. I'll go over this in class again, but you need to understand this was a major change in policy. Previously, the goal of the federal government was to get rid of all the land, sell it, grant it, give it to homesteaders, get rid of it so that somebody could make good use of it. Well, this was a major change in policy. We're going to keep some of it. And the vast majority of the peninsula was actually set aside as the Olympic Forest Reserve. And I've got a book from 1902 of a survey of this forest reserve that was done in the very late last part of the 19th century and describes all of it. Some buddies actually went out there and walked all of it, surveyed all of it. Kind of an amazing task. So anyway, the Olympic Forest Reserve was created, and then in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt moved the forest reserves from the Department of Interior to the Department of Agriculture and a new agency established by his buddy Gifford Pinchot. Okay, that was 1905. Gifford Pinchot had been trying to get his hands on the forest reserves and get them out of that corrupt Department of Interior for years. And of course, he was a good friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, and Teddy was very sympathetic to his point of view. So in 1905, the Olympic Forest Reserve was transferred to basically the Forest Service as Olympic National Forest. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through what happened next. But through a series of steps, first, a national monument was created from part of the reserve for the elk, primarily for the elk. It was just a chunk, kind of right out of the middle of it, kind of a peculiar thing. Administered by the National Forest, by the Forest Service, because the Forest Service can administer national monuments too. And then subsequently, a national park was established. Franklin Roosevelt was kind of the person who made sure that a really significant park was created. And I'll have more to say about that on the trip, but let me tell you, the Park Service didn't want a park with any big trees in it. Can you believe it? The park was, as far as they was concerned, was about the high country and the elk. That's all it was about. And they did everything they could to keep from getting a big chunk of park established over here in the big forest. But in fact, Franklin Roosevelt personally ensured that, in fact, a large national park was established, and one that eventually not only included the core of the peninsula and segments of all of these key river valleys. This is the Bogashio, which has always been a very hotly contested one, because it's not really as awesome as these other three. The timber people have always thought it should be the national park. But anyway, and then a coastal strip. So Basically, the main part of the park, and then as you'll be seeing, there's this coastal strip, which gives us a lot of those near-shore environments in Cedar State. So anyway, through the 20s and 30s and 40s, the battle was fought over the Olympic National Forest and how much of it would be, in fact, transferred into the Olympic National Park, which is administered by a different agency, the National Park Service, not the Forest Service. Now, the Forest Service ended up being left with kind of pieces around the outside. The heart of the forest reserve became park, and then there's some pieces here and some pieces of national forest here and some pieces of national forest and a little bit around the outside. So just leftover bits. Now, one other major thing, two major things perhaps, in terms of landowners. We will be on the Olympic National Park. We'll be on that a lot. We'll also be visiting pieces of the Olympic National Forest. But there's another important landowner on the peninsula that isn't private, and that's the Washington Department of Natural Resources. Now, I told you that the federal government gives the states back, when they become states, a certain amount of land. Actually, it's supposed to be 2 sections in each township. Okay, 2 sections of land in each township. So basically, 1/18 of each township, 1/18 of the land that the federal government owns goes back to the states to be managed for roads and schools and things like that. So the Department of Natural Resources doesn't own any land, but it manages these state trust lands. And in addition to those initial land grants, there are other grants that the state got, that the University of Washington got, Washington State University got, to support their infrastructure, to support their programs. So Department of Natural Resources is responsible for managing a significant amount of trust lands, and the majority of them turn out to be down here in this area of the Clearwater drainage. Okay? Now, normally, basically they're scattered out. Sections 18 and 36 in each township go to these. But if those lands were already taken up by somebody, they already belong to somebody, the state could select some land to make up for those sections that they didn't get, that they were supposed to get. And Washington State was really smart. And the densest part of the Olympic Forest Reserve was right there. Gifford Pinchot loved the forest in that area. He knew about the forest. And if you look at the maps, that's not the most dense part, though, is it, Bob?
No.
The densest part was actually up in the Kawa.
The 2 densest parts were just below the Macaw
Okay.
and the Wainuchi drainage near the bottom.
Yeah, okay. Well, in any case, what the state did was pick out they cherry-picked the very best of the forest stands, including this block here on the Clearwater, as their in lieu of the sections they didn't get lands. And so the Washington Department of Natural Resources, as you're going to see, is a big manager. And those lands have to be managed for income. Okay, now, not just maximizing income. The populist society won't stand for that, just maxing out return, but nevertheless, they have to be managed for significant financial return to the trust. So we have a park, we have a national forest, we have DNR lands, and then we have a big chunk of Indian reservation, the Quinault Indian Reservation. And I'm not going to get into that, but that's the other one of the big land holdings that has a very distinctive kind of history.